Dr. Brian Regal. I'll be giving the last talk for the day. I noticed when I was walking over here, it's already started to spritz a little bit. So I will make this short and sweet. I'm actually quite surprised to see this many people here. I'm happy about it, but it reminds me of when Isaac Newton was a professor at Cambridge. He was so disliked by students that his classes very often were empty. People wouldn't even sign up for them. But in order to get paid, he would still had to do the class. And so he would teach his class to empty classrooms. He'd go in at the ascribed time and give a lecture, including writing on the board and doing demonstrations to completely empty classes. And when he was finished, he would look up and say, "Any questions? No? Okay, see you next week." And he would go. And so what I want to talk about today is using history class methods to enhance non-history classes. This, I think, is a good idea. A lot of us in the history department use ideas and examples from other disciplines like business or science or anthropology and literature. And so non-history professors can use the methods that we employ in our classrooms to enhance what you're doing in your particular disciplines. Now, let me just begin by saying this is not about trying to get you to turn your chemistry class into a history class, or to turn your accounting class into a history class. This is just an offering of another tool you can use to enhance student learning. And if we're going to do this, we should have some idea of what do historians do. So in the simplest sense, what historians do is we examine the past as a way of seeing connections and explanations for the present and a way of anticipating the future. And if you look up any definition of history, you get something like this. It's a little superficial, but it sort of gets the idea across. And so what do we do in our history classes? We teach reading and research skills, writing and communication skills, fact acquisition and analysis skills. So things not that far different from what pretty much all of you do in your class. I think one of the differences between what historians do and what everybody else here does is in the raw material that we use to put these lectures and to put these teaching ideas together. And so I start off here by saying text, text, texts. That is the raw material of what historians do. We look for texts, printed text, manuscripts, letters, correspondence, field notes, diaries. For my doctoral dissertation, for example, I worked on a guy named Henry Fairfield Osborne, who was a scientist. I do the history of science. He was a scientist and the longtime president of the American Museum of Natural History. Literally died in office. He was president of that institution for almost 30 years. And this was a guy who didn't wipe his behind without saving it. And so his papers are a huge collection of stuff and includes everything from typescripts to, in some places, almost something he used to wipe his behind with. So we love text. That's all we think about. When we start a research project, our first instinct is always to say, where are the texts? Where are the original texts? And we're very concerned with this idea of original and primary sources. We always teach our students to get as close as they can to the original. It's not always easy to do that, but the effort is always made to get as close to the original as possible. We also use, aside from the text, we use objects, artifacts, personal interviews, site examination. We're not above going out and digging around in the dirt ourselves to look for little bits and pieces of junk in the ground. And so basically, while we focus on primary texts, we are pretty much willing to look at almost anything. There's no limit to what sort of source material you can use to examine history. And so a lot of you will have this sort of material in your particular discipline, and you can utilize it in this way. Let me just quickly talk about this idea of materialism and naturalism. I call it the scourge of the Enlightenment. In our 21st century, there is, as you've all noticed in all of your fields, there's been a lot of pushback against knowledge, pushback against facts, pushback against reality. And we, more than ever, need to push back against the pushback and to focus on facts and evidence and how we use these. And one of the things that anti-facts people love to do is they love to hit on the Enlightenment and what a horrible, awful thing the Enlightenment was. The Enlightenment, of course, being this period in Western history where facts and evidence become the primary sources of knowledge rather than spiritual belief or hope or scripture. And there are basically two kinds of ideas here, materialism and naturalism, closely related but not exactly the same. There is methodological naturalism, which is where you explain the universe without recourse to any kind of metaphysics. Methodological naturalists will say, well, maybe theological ideas exist, maybe metaphysical ideas exist, but we're simply going to ignore them and try to explain the universe based on facts and evidence. Then there are the slightly more angry philosophical naturalists who do the same thing, but they reject metaphysics out of hand. They don't just ignore it. They say there is no such thing. You can only explain the universe in a rational basis, and so forget all that other stuff. Now, what I'm going to do here, and I'm going to try to end relatively early because the weather's getting a little wacky out there, and I don't want anybody to get killed by driving off the road because they wanted to hang around and listen to what I had to say. And so, no reaction to that at all? You're just going to let that one go right by? Thank you. A little applause. Thank you. Thank you. I'm here all week, by the way. Try the prime beef. What I want to spend time here doing is giving a few examples. I'm not going to be able to cover every single discipline. For those of you who feel a little bit left out by the examples I give and who want to try this, please feel free to contact me, and we can sit down and you can buy me lunch, and I'll explain how your particular area can benefit by this with direct examples. But I'm a historian of science, and I'm a big fan of science. I basically became a historian of science rather than a scientist because I really couldn't really deal with the math. And so in history, there's not a lot of math that we use in history. So probably shouldn't have said that, but okay. It's out there. Deal with it. So if you're teaching a biology course or a zoology course or even a botany course, you can enhance the students' learning by discussing where do these things come from. Now, I know there are members of the faculty across the university who are sort of already doing this kind of thing. But if you're teaching a kind of biology course or zoology, botany course, you can talk about how Darwin, for example, we always say, oh, well, Darwin, he invents evolution. Darwin doesn't actually invent anything. He doesn't even coin the term evolution. What Darwin is famous for, why we still talk about it, and why people, for some odd reason, still get angry at Darwin. There was a book that came out about 10 years ago called Darwin on Trial. And it was an anti-science, anti-evolution book. And I got into a conversation with the guy who was the author. I said, just exactly what crime did Darwin commit that he would be put on trial? And he couldn't really answer me. It was just something about not loving God or something. But Darwin's a very interesting character. One of the weird things about us human beings is that we tend to respond to storytelling as a way of explaining something. And we tend to respond to stories about people doing something, to biography. And so while it's not the only way you can do this, one way to approach the origins of the biological sciences and to explain how we know what we know about various aspects of biology or zoology or botany or any of those disciplines is by telling the story about the people from the past who sort of came up with these ideas and made them popular. And so Darwin's a really easy example to use. Because like my friend Henry Fairfield Osborn, Darwin wrote huge amounts of material, not just printed books, but letters. He would have loved email, he would have loved Twitter. He wrote a dozen letters a day to different people, and almost every single one of them, except for the ones his daughter destroyed because she thought they didn't make him look good enough. Thanks. Almost all those letters are at Cambridge University, and for the past, about 30 years or so, they've been publishing this monumental multi-volume correspondence of Charles Darwin, which currently is up to about volume 25. And these are big, thick tomes, and they still got another 15 to go. And we have all of them in our library, actually, hard copy versions of it. But Darwin's an easy person to use because there's so much material about him. For a faculty member who doesn't really want to spend a lot of time researching this, you can get this material very easily, both in hard copy and in online versions. The letters are also online as well. Now, if you're going for philosophy, if you're going for something else, I teach a course on the history of alchemy, and one of the first things, and the course on the history of medicine, and one of the first things we do is we talk about Aristotelian Greek science, and how so much of modern thinking comes from Greek science. And here I have a little illustration to show, this is basically the way the Greeks saw the universe. You have 4 elements, earth, wind, fire, and water. This was before their recording contract. No? I was going to get that earth, wind, and fire reference? Okay, are we that old that earth, wind, and fire doesn't even? Okay. All right. What time is it? Can I? We call this Aristotelian philosophy, Aristotelian elements. One of the things I always like to say to students is that when we talk about the Greek world, we talk about Greek thought, we're always talking about Aristotle, 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 as if he's the only Greek guy to ever live. And that's unfortunate because the vast majority of the things we credit Aristotle with, he had nothing to do with. Most of the work that we call Aristotelian is actually thought up by other people. And the Greeks get a lot of what they do by sort of pilfering the Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Sumerians, and then kind of codifying it, and then we come along in the West and take it and imagine all those other people never really existed. But it's, again, this is a relatively easy way to introduce students to these ancient ideas. Here's another one. This is Anton van Leeuwenhoek. I have a Dutch friend who always gives me a hard time for mispronouncing Dutch names. And in English-speaking places, we often say van Leeuwenhoek. But she said, no, it's van Leeuwenhoek. I can't even pronounce it because you got to get your jaw going a whole different way. She also yelled at me the very first time we met. She yelled at me because I called the character Tintin. If you remember Tintin, Hergé's, no? Anybody? That's another aspect of my childhood now completely forgotten. It was a wonderful series of cartoons and comic books about this guy who was a young journalist running around the world, getting into all sorts of adventures. And in the West, we called him Tintin. But she said, no, you dumb Americans never say it right. It's Tintin. But anyway, so von Leeuwenhoek is the guy who gets credit with inventing the microscope. And here's a picture of a reconstruction of von Leeuwenhoek's microscope, in which he's the first human being to see what we now refer to as microscopic animals. He called them animalcules. And this illustration makes it seem like this contraption he built was huge. It's actually only about that big. And you had to hold it up to your eye, and you had to put a fire in front of it. But you begin to see the beginnings of scientific instrumentality in the work of von Leeuwenhoek and his invention of the microscope. Historical artwork is also a really easy way to inject some knowledge of the past for the students. This is a painting I often use in my course on the history of alchemy. This is the experiment with an air pump. It's a little tough to see, but where his hand is up like that, that's a giant glass sphere, inside of which is a live dove. And the sort of magician-looking character in the red, you can always tell the magician, alchemist, scholar, because they have the long hair and they know a lot of things. And so that really wasn't the funny part of the... and what he's doing here is suffocating the bird. And this is a famous painting, Right of Derby. You probably recognize some of his paintings. He did this when he also did the one with the orrery, which is the sort of giant mechanical model of the universe. He was an incredible exponent of chiaroscuro and extreme light, what we would today call cinematic lighting in a painting. And this is actually a life-size. This is a little bigger than what it is, but it's actually a life-size painting. It's in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And whenever I'm there, I always feel obliged to go visit, because the guy in the red, the guy that looks like the magician, that's Robert Boyle, who is the person who develops Boyle's law, and he works with microscopes, and he works with air pumps, and he was an alchemist, wrote a book with one of the greatest titles in the history of book production called The Skeptical Chemist. It's right up there with the Chemical Wedding. Another, no, okay. Oh boy, I am shooting out these references and they're just flying all over the place. But artwork, there are quite a bit of, there's quite a bit of artwork representing historical events that you can use. And all this stuff is online that you can get for free very easily. We also run a course in the history department on the history of printing and on book history, and any course, whether it's a literature course or even the sciences, this idea of the role that printing plays in the spreading of information. And you can show pictures, cool pictures of old printing presses, and talk about how the printing press was invented and how movable type was invented, not by Gutenberg. That's another thing that people often get. Students will say, wait a minute, you said Gutenberg didn't, I thought we were always taught that Gutenberg invented printing. Gutenberg doesn't invent printing. He doesn't even invent movable type. Movable type goes back to the 900s in Korea and China. But what he does, more appropriately, the reason why we remember Gutenberg is because he sort of modifies the printing press to allow for things to be printed much faster. Now, in a literature course, for example, if you're talking about Shakespeare, there's tons of material you can use on Shakespeare. Who was Shakespeare? I mean, one of the great, I just got finished with a ridiculous online argument about the identity of Shakespeare. I am not an expert in the field, but I consider myself a Stratfordian, which means you have way too much time on your hands, and who believes that this guy, the famous picture, that's Shakespeare, and that's the guy who wrote the, and there are Oxfordians who say it was the Earl of Oxford, and Baconians who, and they get really angry about this if you, but the first folio is a really useful, if you're teaching a course on literature, world literature, or even a course specifically on Shakespeare, about how the English language fundamentally changes with the appearance of the first folio, because there are words, huge number of words that we use in everyday language, including the word everyday language, which are first employed by Shakespeare. And you can talk about what makes an author, what's the definition of an author, what is the definition of authorship. When I was 9 years old, I saw a documentary on PBS on Channel 13 about Shakespeare. And they talked about the first folio and why the first folio was so important, and it's so rare, and it's so valuable, and they go for $1 million. Even a crappy, beat-up version goes for $1 million. And a few days later, I was down on the Avenue, and I went into, there was a consignment shop there that I used to go to go in and look at, and I found a copy of Shakespeare's first folio. And the owner of the store had no idea he had this. And so in my best 9-year-old cool way, I said, "How much is this?" And he said, 25 cents. And I said, "I'll take it." And I tried to be as cool and as nonchalant as possible. Got it in that little bag, you know, that little brown paper bag, and walked out and yelled in joy. And I ran home, and I said, "I have found a first folio of Shakespeare for 25 cents. I couldn't believe it. It started me on a career. I would not be standing here before you right now if it wasn't for that copy of the first folio I found. And I figured I can sell this, and, you know. Of course, it was not a first folio. It was a beat-up paperback copy of Julius Caesar. But for a couple of days, I thought, you know. Now, in an anthropology class, I do a lot of work on monsters. I write books on monsters and what monsters are, and if I may engage in the shameless self-promotion part of the lecture here, my latest book, written with my colleague here at Kane, Dr. Frank Esposito, on the Jersey Devil, will be out in a couple of weeks. And a very affordable paperback copy from the Johns Hopkins University Press, by the way. Thank you. No, I'm just going to, again, just going to go for those. But oddly, people seem to be fascinated by monsters. And if you're talking about anthropology, if you're talking about religious history, if you're talking about theology, you can use, these are illustrations from none other than Martin Luther. The creature on the left there, that is the monk calf. The one on the right is the papal ass of Rome. You can get an idea what that's all about, and how obviously neither of these ever actually exist in reality, but the idea of propaganda, and using monstrous creatures to make fun of somebody you don't like or an organization you don't like was really popular then and now. And so, again, here's a way to kind of draw students in. When I teach a course here on the history of pseudoscience, and when I was first putting the course together, what I really wanted to do was do a philosophy of science course. But I realized on my own and in consultation with some of my wonderful colleagues that the idea of the philosophy of science would draw absolutely zero students. No one would be interested in this. And so I thought about it, and I said, oh, okay, I'll do pseudoscience. And I'll be very sly. I will be able to approach the idea of the philosophy of science, but use monsters and flying saucers and ghosts and things to do it. And it works. You know, the students have no idea while we're talking about ghost hunters that they're learning about the fundamentals of philosophy. We do a lot of global business here, a lot of accounting, economics, management. Adam Smith, of course, is another really easy way to discuss the origins of economics and to look at how early economics were done. I know some people who teach these classes here have students read Adam Smith, his On the Wealth of Nations, but you can get into who Smith was and what were his motivations behind doing this. Now, here is the movie poster for Tolkien's The Hobbit. In literature classes, students often will read The Hobbit. I always get students coming in saying, oh, I read The Hobbit, I love The Hobbit. When I was in high school, every pompous, self-important, pseudo-intellectual twit read Tolkien. And then would come up to me and say, man, you got to read The Hobbit, man. Frodo's God, man. He's like Jesus, man. And so we get into fights about that. And so students like to read this, and so you can enhance their learning of this in the classroom and without, and by seeing the movies, by looking at the history of the people who wrote it. Tolkien was a member of a group, a loose group of other writers, including Charles Williams, C.S. Lewis, Owen Barfield, who were called the Inklings, and they lived in Oxford. They were all Oxford faculty members, and they would sit down with each other and tell each other what they were writing about, and they would discuss big philosophical issues and even read out loud to each other their latest work and critique it. And they were smart enough to do this in local pubs. And if you ever get a chance to go to Oxford, and I strongly recommend you do, it's a drinking paradise. You almost can't throw a rock without hitting not just a bar. These aren't just bars. These aren't just places to go and get drunk, although you can do that. These are historic sites in and of themselves. There are a number of bars in Oxford that originally opened and have been in continuous use since the 1400s. And have had very little architectural elements within them changed. And one of my favorites is the Eagle and Child. This is where the Inklings met, and they would sit and they would read. Their favorite corner, which is now memorialized as the Rabbit Room, and they would sit there and talk about what they were doing. And I was never a big Tolkien fan myself, but I found the story of the writing of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings much more interesting than the actual books themselves. And in one of the greatest stories in all of literature, Tolkien goes to a publisher and they decide to publish The Hobbit. It comes out, it's a huge success. And so they come back to him and they say, okay, well, you got another one. We want another one. We're on a roll here. Give us another book. And so he says, okay, I got another one. And so he's been working on this manuscript for a while, and he thinks it's done, and he brings it to the Eagle and Child, and he's going to talk to his friends, these guys, and he says, I got my latest book, can I start reading it to you? And they're like, yeah, sure. And he starts reading. And one of the Inklings, whose picture isn't here, Richard Dyson, he's listening now. He's already half in the bag when Tolkien starts reading. And so now Tolkien is beginning to read out loud in a bar, The Lord of the Rings. And Dyson leans back in his chair, and at the top of his lungs, he says, oh my God, not more frigging elves. But he didn't say frigging. He used a different word. We're in mixed company here, so got to use some professorial decorum. And I find that students always kind of get a tickle out of that story. But the history of how things are written. Oh, and also in Oxford, there's this actual spot, which is right out on the street. It's not in a museum. This is an actual house. And it looks just like what you're seeing in the picture. This is the doorway that C.S. Lewis always claimed inspired him to write the line, The Witch in the Wardrobe. So you can actually go up to this and touch it. You know, you can see the gold paint. Well, it's sort of hard to see, but the gold paint is sort of nice and fresh and new because so many people go up there and start, you know, making out with these things that every couple of months they have to repaint them. Now, as I said before, historians, we're fixated on original texts. We always insist to students to go for as close to the originals as possible. And there is really little better connection to the past than being able to physically touch original text, letters, or even objects that were used by the people or the discipline that you're talking about. Here, for example, on the left, it's not a copy of Shakespeare's manuscript, but it's a fairly old transcription of Richard III, which exists and which you can look at. And it sounds almost metaphysical to say, but this idea of touching something from the past. This book I mentioned before that I'm about to have published on the Jersey Devil, some of the original material that we needed to use for this is in the British Library in London. And a couple of years I went over, and it's the very first, and very few of these, I don't have the time to explain to you the whole story, but this guy, Daniel Leeds, was an early New Jersey resident who published the first almanac and other books in New Jersey. And most of them were censored, most of them were destroyed, which is why none of you recognize the name when I say Daniel Leeds. But the British Library had one of the very few remaining copies of his very first almanac. And you sit in this magnificent reading room, and somebody pushes the cart, and you hear him coming, you know, that squeaky wheel cart sound. And suddenly there I am holding this original document. And it was really quite emotional. And to know that I'm holding this thing, which I'd seen before in copies, but here was an original, one of the very few originals remaining, that was held by Daniel Leeds, that was held by William Bradford, the printer. And to get your students that close, it's great things to do experiments in a science class and to read literature in a literature class and to do mathematics in a math class, but to actually hold pieces of the past related to this, I think really helps students understand the material better. And so whenever you have a chance to do such a thing, I strongly recommend that you do it. Even in areas that you might not think, like the history of physical culture, sports medicine, physical therapy. All of Jack LaLanne's TV shows are archived, and you can watch them. And you can explain to your physical therapy students, where does all this come from? How do we know to twist the knee like this? How do we know? If you look at in the background of this picture, it's a little bit hard to see, but he's got a list of all the stuff you shouldn't eat. And it seems kind of funny, you know, but this is where our modern ideas about nutrition and exercise come from. So that when students are learning how to do this, they have this idea that this thing that I'm doing, this thing that I spent 4 years getting a degree in, it has a history. And to understand what the history is and how it enhances how I do the thing that I'm doing. And all of the fields that we teach here at Kane, you can do this for. This is one of my favorite things, just back to Darwin a little bit, and this idea of original sources. This is what's called Notebook B. Darwin was an inveterate note-taker. He was always carrying little notebooks around him, constantly scribbling on the back of napkins and things. And it's kind of hard to see a little bit here, but this picture that you're looking at is literally the very, very, very first time anybody had ever drawn an image of the tree of life and how Darwin felt evolution worked. And that alone makes it a great, I've actually held this in my hand, it's at Cambridge, and that alone makes it great. But if you look at the upper left-hand corner, I'm not sure if you can see what that says. It says, I think. So even he's not sure yet. This is an image which literally changes the world. The world is a different place after this, fundamentally changed, whether you like it or not, whether you believe in evolution or not believe in evolution, the world changes on a fundamental level because of this, and the guy doing it is still not really sure. And that's an example of how this kind of connection to the past really helps. Now, last thing I'll talk about, I started off by saying how this idea of, we're at war. You may not understand this. We're at war, and the things we're trying to save is reality. We're trying to save facts and evidence. We're trying to keep it away from the dark minions of lying and falsehoods and just making crap up. And we have an obligation to fight that fight. And we get a lot of talk about fake news today and pseudoscientific belief. And these are some things I use in class. I originally just used this information in my class on pseudoscience. But now I use it even in my freshman classes, my intro to world history classes. These different ideas, these different philosophies of how fake news, pseudoscience works. I'll just go through them real quick. The first off is confirmation bias, that is, those facts and opinions which tend to support our previously held position. The idea is we accept as real anything that supports our position. If it doesn't support our position, well, that's fake. Selective evidence compiling, that's where if you have one little bit that supports your notion of what should be and everything else says the opposite, that just proves you're right. You'll hold on to that one piece that says, yes, the earth is flat, and by the way, it's not flat. I'm just going to throw that out there because I get into a lot of arguments, really stupid, ridiculous arguments online about this, and flat earthers. A guy called me a globularist the other day. And I said, oh, that's fantastic. I'm going to use that. I'm going to get a bumper sticker that says, I'm a globularist. The backfire effect. This is a very common one. The more evidence that you're wrong just proves to you that you're right. It's very commonly used amongst fake news, pseudoscience people. The more you so-called experts with your fancy schmancy educations and your book learning, the more you tell me I'm wrong, the more I know I'm right. And then finally, knowledge source reversal, which says that a trained scholar is not as smart as an untrained amateur. It's one of my favorites. Just because you spent your entire adult life studying this thing doesn't mean you know more than I do. I read the Wikipedia page, man. I'm an expert on DNA. I get really angry about stuff like that. And one way you can teach your students to deal with this rise in, or this emphasis on fake news, what's the source? Where does it come from? Can you confirm this? Is there any evidence for this thing that you believe? Think before you pass it along. A general rule of thumb, if it sounds too outrageous, it's probably fake. And question everything. Now, there's also one of the ways you can do all this without having to put too much energy into it. Because again, this is not about getting you to turn your accounting class into a history class or your chemistry class into a history class. It's about using this as a tool. And so I understand you don't want to spend a lot of time, digging through material just so you can spend one lecture on Darwin or, Adam Smith or something. But this thing that we refer to now is digital history. There are huge amounts of material out there online. Giant letters collections from people in all kinds of disciplines, rare books that have been scanned, artwork that's been scanned. And so whatever your particular discipline is, if you want to make reference to some original works, it's very easy for you to find things out there. It takes 2 seconds. If you can come across something, if you want your students to read some weird old book on your topic, a lot of this stuff has been digitized. Google Scholar, the Bodleian Library at Oxford, the Wellcome Library in London, the Library of Congress, even the New York Public Library. People tend not to think of the New York Public Library as this great scholarly source, but it's really one of the greatest libraries on earth. They have a huge collection of hard-to-find, rare material that you can access. And a lot of it's online, and so you don't really have to make your students buy more books. I know that's a big deal because the huge amount of money textbooks cost these days. You can get this stuff for free online. People want you to use it, so it's out there to use. And so in the end, what my suggestion is that you can enhance your students' learning about your particular topic by throwing a little history in there, and that the way you do this is fairly simple and straightforward and not really complicated, doesn't cost anything, and I think you'll find that your students get a better appreciation, or at least an increased appreciation for the topics that you're teaching them. And I would like to thank you for showing up today. And any questions? Oh, good. Oh, okay. Yes. Right. Oh, human fetus soup, sure. I love it. No, actually, I don't love it. Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, I would tell them what you just said. That's a real issue. There are information sites out there who lie shamelessly about the weirdest stuff. And for us as faculty, you just have to accept that this is going to be an endless fight. We're never going to reach a point where we can say, oh, look at that. Nobody believes in that crap anymore. You just have to know as much as possible about your field and be able to tell students basically what you said, that something that outrageous, it wouldn't be in some odd little place. It would be something talked about. Because I work on the history of monster hunting, students often come up to me and say, well, Bigfoot's real. Why do you think there is no Bigfoot? Because, there's not a Bigfoot. I just wanted to say that, get that. There's no such thing as a Jersey Devil, no Bigfoot, no Yeti, no Chupacabra, none of that stuff. No Loch Ness Monster. And I would say to them basically what you said. If Bigfoot was real, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We would just know it's real. We don't, one of the things people always want to bring up about Bigfoot, they'll say, well, no one's ever found, people rarely find bear skeletons in the woods. Because one of the things people say is, well, if Bigfoot was real, we'd have found, a dead one somewhere, a carcass desiccating, something like that. And that just has never happened. And they say, yeah, but bears are real. And I say, yeah, but we know about bears. We've found bears. There's no question that bears are real. They might be rare, but we know that they're there. If Bigfoot was real, Bigfoot would be getting into your garbage. And they'd be getting, they supposedly lived up there in the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest. By now, one of them would be splattered all over the front grill of one of those giant 18-wheelers that carry the logs around. In the middle of the night, the trucks run into deer all the time. They run into bears all the time. Possums dead on the road. Never dead Bigfoot lying on the road. And so this idea of when a student comes up with something outrageous like Chinese fetus soup, that's one of the ways you approach. And I've given students extra credit assignments when they come up with something crazy like that. I'll say, okay, this is what you're going to do. I want you to go out and research this. Find out where this information comes from. Write me a 2-page essay on the historiography of Chinese fetus soup. And I'll give you extra credit for it. And like I said before, we're never going to do away with belief in fairies or flying saucers or whatever. What we do is we do the thing we here do best. We teach our students how to think. I always tell my students, our job as the faculty here is not to get you to think like us, it's to get you to think. And if you do that, you'll be good. You'll be okay. And, you know, we cross our fingers and we hope that it works out. Did that help at all? Go ahead. Right. Well, yes to all of that. And one of the ways you can do that is through the use of history in your non-history class. So once again, thanks for coming, and try not to drive off the road in the bad weather on the way home tonight. All right, thank you.